Alabama, let's get it.
The process, no one can stop this. Hottest show in the streets, I bet you can't top this. Rammer, jammer, yellow hammer, come see how we rock this. Alabama fans the best, there's no way you can top this. Recruiting news and interviews, just sit back and watch this.
Recruiting news and interviews, just sit back and watch this.
The process.
Hey everyone, welcome into The Process, Crimson Tide Recruiting. I am your host, Justin Smith, the scouting and recruiting analyst for Touchdown Alabama magazine. Thank you guys so much for joining me today on our YouTube page. Go ahead, hit that subscribe button below so you can stay updated on all of our content here at TouchdownAlabama.com. The Process will air every Tuesday and Thursday evening right here on our YouTube page. You know, this episode with this Saturday being the Tide's home opener against the Texas A&M Aggies, I want to take a look at some recruiting storylines surrounding this matchup, as the Tide and the Aggies have had some interesting head-to-head recruiting battles over the last couple of recruiting cycles. So I want to take a look at those past recruiting battles that were pretty interesting. Also talk about some of their mutual targets moving forward here in this 2021 recruiting cycle. I will dive right into that with recruiting updates being a bit slow at the moment, so we're going to go right into those interesting recruiting storylines between the Tide and the Aggies. So with that being said, let's get the process started. When you look at the Tide and the Aggies, like the rest of the SEC, they tend to recruit a lot of the same guys, which basically puts the SEC on a collision course when it comes to the recruiting trail. And we have seen the Tide and the Aggies collide on multiple occasions, and these collisions have had their impact and have made their impact on both teams' rosters. When you look at the Tide roster, when you look at the inside linebacker position, one of their starting linebackers is Christian Harris, who was once verbally committed to Texas A&M. As of August 2018, he was an Aggie commit before he eventually verbally committed to Alabama, flipping his commitment from Texas A&M after taking an official visit to Tuscaloosa in November. We have seen what Christian Harris has been able to do during his short time in Tuscaloosa. He started as a freshman due to some injuries at that inside linebacker position for the Crimson Tide. Tide had to lean on him early. He was pretty productive, showed a lot of potential during his first year in Tuscaloosa. And as you guys saw on last Saturday, he showed a lot of great things on last Saturday against the Missouri Tigers. Showed a lot of comfortableness lining up beside a Louisiana native in Dylan Moses. But when you look at Christian Harris flipping his commitment to the Crimson Tide in the 2019 recruiting class, you can say that that was kind of payback when it comes to the Crimson Tide flipping a commitment from Texas A&M, because in the 2018 recruiting cycle, if you guys can remember, Bobby Brown, a 4-star defensive tackle at the time, actually flipped his commitment from Texas A&M to the Tide on National Signing Day during the early signing period, but he did not sign with the Tide during that early signing period. He was just verbally committed at that particular time. And when I think about him flipping his commitment from Texas A&M to Alabama, I think he decommitted from Texas A&M on National Signing Day during the early signing period, and he verbally committed to the Tide days later, but he did not sign with the Tide during the early signing period. He actually stayed verbally committed to the Tide, and he flipped his commitment back to Texas A&M on National Signing Day during the traditional signing period. And when you look at Bobby Brown, he was a 4-star defensive tackle during his recruitment process, but now he looks to be one of the more impactful players on the defensive side of the football for the Texas A&M Aggies. When you look at Harris and you also look at Brown, look at the impact that they have been able to make on their respective squads, you see that this head-to-head recruiting battle between the Tide and the Aggies is intense for a reason, because they are going after some of the top talent in the country. Even in the 2020 recruiting class, we look at McKinley Jackson, the 4-star defensive tackle out of Mississippi, who the Tide and the Aggies were competing for very hard in the 2020 recruiting cycle. Of course, Jackson signed with the Texas A&M Aggies, but the Tide were right there to the end. We saw Nick Saban going on a home visit with McKinley Jackson before he eventually signed with Texas A&M. So these recruiting battles are intense. They are looking to become more intense in the 2021 recruiting cycle, as they have a couple of mutual targets still on the board, a couple of guys who have not announced a verbal commitment yet. Taking a look at now the Tide's 2021 targets, who also are on the Texas A&M Aggies board. When you look at Thomas Shadillier first, the 4-star defensive end out of Texas, who was expected to play his senior season at IMG Academy, but he decided to opt out of his senior season. But he is spending his senior year in the state of Texas, in his hometown in Texas. And when you look at Adillier, after he decommitted from the Ohio State Buckeyes, he has been showing a lot of love to a lot of different schools, including the Florida Gators, the Crimson Tide, along with the Texas A&M Aggies. And when you look at Adillier, I think the Tide is in a great position with them. But if I am on the Tide's coaching staff, or if I am on Texas A&M's coaching staff, I am looking at this game as a huge recruiting win if I can pick up a win in this matchup, especially with the recruiting dead period being extended through January 1st. You can't get guys on campus and say, yo, my facility is better than that guy's facility. You can do it through the Zoom call, but nothing beats seeing it in person and actually walking through those facilities. But one thing you can do is beat the team lined up in front of you and show that, yo, we beat that team that you are considering. We beat that school that you are considering, showing that we are the better school. So I think that is something both coaching staffs will have in mind, especially if they pull out a win in Saturday's matchup. Another guy to pay attention to here is Shemar Turner, the 4-star defensive end out of Texas. Another defensive end out of Texas who the Tide and Aggies are both competing for. Rumors are that Shemar Turner wants to stay at home in Texas, and if Texas A&M can pull off a win over the Tide, with the Tide being one of Shemar Turner's top choices, it can really help Texas A&M battle in their fight for Shemar Turner if they can pull off a win over the Tide. Same works for the Tide as well if they are able to pull off a huge win over Texas A&M, which they have been able to do over the last couple of seasons. If they're able to pick up another win over the Aggies, it's something that they can use on the recruiting trail as well, and I trust that they will do that, especially when you look at them recruiting guys that Texas A&M is recruiting as well. Another guy to pay attention to here is Brandon Thomas Jr., the 4-star wide receiver, the physical, long, lengthy wide receiver out of Louisiana. When you look at Brandon Thomas Jr., he is the type of wide receiver who Texas A&M usually lands. They usually go after those big, physical, tall wide receivers, and Brandon Thomas Jr. fits that mold. The Tide can use this game as a recruiting win for them as well. Show off that wide receiver talent that they currently have. When you look at Devontae Smith, Jalen Waddle, along with their rising star in John Mechie, they can show off that talent, show it to Brian Thomas, who is more than likely going to watch the game, especially with both the Tide and the Aggies being included in his top 4. So on this episode of The Process, I just wanted to take a look at some key recruiting storylines. Also talk about just the crazy recent recruiting history that the Tide Aggies have had on the recruiting trail.
The process.